So in this video, we're going to talk about utilising isometrics. Starting off with an overview, isometrics is a term given to a muscular contraction that is static in nature. It can either be holding a joint in place, so for example, if you're holding a cup of tea like this, you bring it upstairs or something like that, or it can be pushing against a very heavy resistance that is immovable. Okay, so for example, you might be trying to push a car with the handbrake on, and that would be an isometric contraction, pushing against that resistance at the knee extensor muscles, hip extensor muscles, and ankle flexor muscles as well. So they can also occur for very short periods in dynamic movements. So in plyometrics, you go through what's called an amortization phase as you transition from the eccentric lengthening of a muscle, then going into the concentric. That time in between, there's a very brief isometric contraction, but also with a lot of our dynamic strength movements like our squats and hinges, often if we perform a brief pause at the bottom, that'll also be an isometric contraction as well. So in terms of types of isometrics, we have overcoming or pushing isometrics. These involve pushing against an immovable object, much like our car example. Okay, they stimulate the concentric shortening action of our muscles. So although it's pushing into a concentric contraction, they're not obviously, the muscles aren't actually shortening concentrically because we're pushing against an immovable object. They can be done at specific positions to improve max force outputs and also our rate of force development. So basically how much force we can produce in as little time as possible. And generally they're prescribed for less than 15 seconds in a single bout for multiple reps often, and also at a hard to maximal effort. Our second type is our yielding, also known as holding isometric. Here the job is to hold our joint in a specific position, whether it's gravity pulling us down or resistance pulling us down. Our job is to try and hold the position and not let our muscles lengthen eccentrically, okay? These happen to be the more taxing of the two, reason being that eccentric contraction is going to be more taxing. Generally we can load more resistance in these positions as well, as opposed to the concentric one. An easy example is if you're doing a pull-up and you're going to pull yourself up, you're going to be able to do less weight than if you're going to lower yourself down. So eccentrically we can provide more overload. There's going to be more muscle damage as well in these types of contractions. But again, our job in the yielding or holding isometrics is to try and resist any motion. So we're trying to hold that position and not lose the joint angle there. Because of the fatiguing nature of them, they are prescribed between 3 and 45 seconds, generally more towards the higher end and not usually at as high an intensity as the overcoming isometrics, which generally are performed for less duration. Finally, the final type that we'll talk about is the Badger protocols, which I first came across at complementarytraining.net, which is a really good resource, training resource. Essentially, these involve isometric contractions. They're not just isometric. They include dynamic, concentric, eccentric contractions as well, so moving up and down. Generally, they contain yielding or holding isometrics. But you can find out more about the Badger protocols in the newsletter. I won't go too much into them now. So now talking about measurement. In order to prescribe and monitor isometric training, you need to have accurate and reliable measurements. So unfortunately, this can be quite expensive for a recreational athlete, requiring either force plates or G-strength equipment and software to provide super precise measurements, specifically for peak or max force outputs, but also for rate of force development. And that's specifically for the overcoming isometrics. So for the overcoming isometrics, it can be quite expensive to really accurately and reliably measure them. 3 variables do exist that allow us to prescribe and measure isometrics though. They are time, load, and position. So all you need to be able to measure them is a timer, a coach and/or camera, and of course, some equipment. These 3 variables, they work really well for the yielding or holding isometrics, not so well for the overcoming isometrics. Obviously time is always going to be useful and holding the joint position, but because you're pushing against a movable object, generally you don't want that object to move, so you're not going to get the same data, the force outputs that you would get from a force plate. But that's not to say they're not still useful training stimuluses. Although you can't measure them directly, you may see improvements in certain markers such as, vertical jump height or broad jump height, or, even if you're starting to see improvements in your, maximal speed or acceleration, even though they're not direct, you can't say, okay, for sure, my overcoming isometric strength has improved, therefore this has happened. You can't say that directly, but if these sort of things are improving and the only thing you've changed is the isometrics, then it's highly likely that they're helping. So now application. So actually, getting into the nitty-gritty of starting to use isometrics. These variables can struggle to really capture an accurate account for overcoming isometrics as discussed. Although one method I have explored is using a load that you can only just not move. So for example, if you're doing a single leg mid-stance push, if you're doing this and the bar is starting to move upwards off the pins, then essentially you know that you're able to lift that. So you need to get some more weight on it. Okay, it's not the idea with the overcoming isometrics, but if you get to the point where, 3 weeks ago you couldn't move that weight at all, and now you're starting to get that little bit of lift, guess what? You've got stronger. So just to kind of go on with that a little bit more, this does carry a little bit higher risk due to the maximal loads being moved. Obviously, super heavy loads on one leg, there's going to be a risk there. So once a slight concentric movement is noticed, if there's a coach there, they want to, be there to stand by and make sure that weight's not going to move off the pins. But also, the weight should be controlled, lowered back to the pins. Once that movement's starting to be felt and it feels okay, there it is. Control, slowly move that, allow yourself to come back to the pins, load it up again, and then you should be able to move it once more. And again, if in a few weeks you start to move it again, you're starting to know you've got stronger. It's not the best measurement, and like I said, you need to be very careful when you're doing that to make sure it's safe, but it is going to give you an idea of actually my overcoming isometric here has got stronger. For the yielding and badger protocols, it's a lot easier. You can use percentage of 1 rep max like you would get from your dynamic strength exercise. So for example, if your max is 100 kilogram back squat, 70% will be 70 kilograms. You can use them really well. RPE also works really well for them as well, and RPE is also what I use for the overcoming isometrics. As with most training, longer durations are prescribed with lower intensities and vice versa. So for example, with Badger protocol, if you're doing again, read the newsletter to sort of find out more about the Badger protocol, but if you're doing the 10 rep Badger protocol, so you do 10-second hold, 10 reps, 10-second hold again, this will be prescribed at around 40 to 50%. Okay, even though a 10 rep max is going to be roughly 75%, because you're doing the 10-second yielding hold at the start and at the end, I suggest going between 40 and 50%, because if you try and do 75%, well, good luck. So this now brings us to why not just do dynamic exercise? Well, in no way am I saying that isometric training is supremely better than dynamic exercises. The opposite is also untrue. Dynamic exercises are not supremely better than isometrics. They are both tools to drive specific adaptations in a certain context, working with a certain individual at a certain time. So some really useful things about isometrics are as follows. Somebody recovering from an injury, they're great because you can control them really well, and also they are generally a lot safer than moving dynamically. There can be more control over how that specific tissue is moving and the forces applied on it. Simplicity is also really useful here. While still being able to produce very large force outputs. You're literally just holding a position, but you can hold a position and you can really push hard, or you can hold a position and really resist hard. So super simple, but again, you can really have that effort that you need to cause adaptation. An example of this would be with single leg options. So for example, with a single leg squat, okay, let's say I'm doing like a single leg skater squat. There's no way I'm going to be able to produce the same outputs as what I would be doing with a single leg isometric pin push. Okay, you can see the effort there, right? My face is like this. I'm holding it. It's really hard. My legs are shaking. There's a lot of force going on there. I'm moving on one leg 140 kilograms or something. Could I do that with a skater squat? No way. So the force outputs there are really, really high. But you wouldn't be able to get that from a dynamic exercise, typically. Maybe with some jumps and variations like that, but in terms of the actual peak force and prolonging that peak force for a good period of time, you're just not going to get that from something like a skater squat. Another benefit is there's going to be reduced muscle soreness when compared to eccentric exercise. So if you're doing dynamic exercises that involve the eccentric phase, generally you're going to have more DOMS, onset muscle soreness. So essentially, you can still develop strength, you can still develop rate of force development without having that added on fatigue that may stop you from being super fresh if you've got quite a busy schedule. So if you've got, a running race every weekend, if you've got a game or a fight, in 3 times in, 2 weeks or something along these lines, then you're going to want to be super fresh. Or if you've just got a really busy training schedule with lots of different aspects of training going on at the same time, again, you might not want to be really sore. So isometrics can work really well, as can concentric exercise only, in order to not make this the case. What's more, you can develop muscular hypertrophy, especially in the muscles in stretch positions. So if you're performing a yielding or even a pushing isometric, but you're quite low into the position, there's quite a lot of knee flexion, for example, if it's targeting the quad muscles, you're going to get some really good muscle hypertrophy there, and there's quite a lot of research to support that. Also improved tendon stiffness as well, which can help things like running economy. Okay, if your tendons are stiff and your tendons are giving you like spring-like action into each step, that's going to require less work from the muscles, so you'll be more economic. You'll use less energy. But of course, there are going to be limitations. Some are difficulty with the intensity prescription compared to dynamic strength. So dynamic strength, obviously, again, if you know your 1 rep max, easy. You know what percentage you're working at. And if you know your 1 rep max, you can then find out your relative max. So you can find out roughly what your 5 rep max is, your 8 rep max is, etc. Obviously, when it comes to the overcoming isometrics, if you don't have force plates, you can't do that. You can't say, right, I want you to push at 80% for 10 seconds, because you don't know what 80% of max is without a force plate or a G strength bit of kit. It may not provide kinesthetic and postural control that you would get from dynamic movements, but also buy-in as well can be a little bit difficult. They may not look actually as sexy as like dynamic or ballistic exercises. Again, just this example of like pushing really hard, holding a position, your face going red, you're like, oh, and that is what it's like at times, and you're not moving. Does it look sexy? Maybe not. So if I haven't put you off with them limitations, you can of course try them out. So in doing so, I do believe that isometrics should completely replace traditional dynamic exercises. So you can try replacing some sets instead. For example, replace 5 sets of squats with 3 sets plus 2 isometric sets, using the adaptation to decide the rep range and intensity. So if you're really trying to drive your 1 rep max squat and really get your maximal strength up, you're doing like doubles, singles, triples maybe, then you could do your pushing isometrics in a sticking point of a squat. So you could go, if it's the bottom, you could go quite low down in that squat position, push up into it for, let's say, 5 seconds for a couple of reps, rest as you would for a normal set, and then repeat that for that second set. And that would be how you could add in isometrics without taking away the dynamic exercise as well. What's more, complex training method can be applied as well, which works really nicely. Thanks to Danny Lum for this great idea. In listening to some of the podcasts that he's done, he's talked about using complex training. So for example, you'd go from a heavy isometric or hard isometric, you'd rest for a minute or two, and then you would go into either a ballistic or plyometric exercise that simulates that same sort of isometric movement. So for example, if it's a mid stance, or if it's like a partial squat position and you're pushing up, okay, you might want to pair that with something like a drop jump as a complex set. Finally, before I go into the actual prescriptions, make sure you do set them up safely, especially heavy yielding variations. Make sure that you can easily put the weight down. So if you're doing a yielding back squat, for example, you're holding that bottom position, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Generally, if it's high intensity, you're probably not going to want to push out from that. So make sure you've got them pins set up there. You can just lower it down an inch or two more to the pins, take the plates off, stand it back up, and then repeat when you're ready. So do make sure the safety is there. Same thing with the overcoming ones as well. Make sure the bar's not moving. Obviously, then it would not be an overcoming isometric, but also you don't want to find that you've got 200 kilos on one leg. It's probably going to be quite tricky to handle that. So yeah, that's that. What I'll do is I'll put a isometric prescription table, probably a link in the description. I don't know, maybe it'll be here in the video as well, and you can see based on different adaptations that you're trying to develop, what sort of rep ranges, set ranges, intensity ranges you should be using for isometrics. Also in the description, we will have a link to an example day. Okay, so you can see how isometrics could actually be fit into a training session and what an example day would look like. I think the example I've done is like a general strength phase, so kind of an off-season general strength phase where isometrics are built in. Thanks for watching. Please check out the newsletter with the isometrics for some more detail and to be able to see some of the visuals. And yeah, happy training.